taught that archaeologists are seekers of truth, brave explorers uncovering the secrets of history. But what if some secrets were never meant to be found? In the quiet halls of the world's most famous museums, there are objects kept under heavy lock and key. Not because they are fragile, but because they are heavy. Heavy with a history of sudden tragedy, unexplained illness, and a darkness that science simply cannot explain. From the screaming mummies of Egypt to the blood-stained altars of the Aztecs, today we're stepping into the shadows. These are the 12 cursed artifacts that even the experts refuse to touch. November 4th, 1922. A date etched in the annals of history, not just for the gold discovered, but for the shadow it cast. Howard Carter, a British archaeologist who had spent years scouring the Valley of the Kings, finally hit stone. A step, then another, then a sealed doorway. When he finally peered through a tiny hole and Lord Carnarvon asked if he could see anything, Carter famously replied, "Yes, wonderful things." But those wonderful things came with a warning. Legend has it that near the door, they found a clay tablet that read, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king." Curiously, that tablet later disappeared from the official records. Coincidence? Or the first sign of a cover-up? The tragedy began just 5 months later. Lord Carnarvon, the man who funded the entire dig, died in Cairo. The cause? A mosquito bite on his cheek that became infected after he accidentally cut it while shaving. It sounds mundane, almost too simple. But here's where it gets eerie. At the exact moment he passed away, all the lights in Cairo reportedly went out. Back in England, miles away, his beloved dog Susie let out a howl and dropped dead. When the media got hold of this, the curse of the pharaohs was born. But for the scientists, the mystery was just beginning. You see, when they finally performed an autopsy on King Tut's mummy, they found a healed lesion on the king's left cheek, in the exact same spot where the mosquito had bitten Carnarvon. The body count didn't stop there. George J. Gould, a wealthy financier who visited the tomb, died of a fever shortly after. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, the radiologist who x-rayed the mummy, died just days after handling the body. By 1935, the press claimed at least 21 people connected to the excavation had met untimely, often bizarre ends. Now, let's look at the insights. If you're an archaeologist today, do you actually fear a ghost? Not exactly. You fear the invisible dwellers. For over 3,000 years, that tomb was a sealed biological time capsule. When Carter cracked that seal, he didn't just let in light, he woke up ancient spores. Specifically Aspergillus flavus. This is a deadly fungus that can survive for millennia in the lungs of mummies or on the walls of damp tombs. For someone with a weakened immune system, like Lord Carnarvon, breathing in these spores would cause a catastrophic respiratory failure. Symptoms that look a lot like a curse to someone in 1923. But there's a psychological layer too. The Nocebo Effect. If you believe you are cursed, your body can literally manifest physical illness. The stress, the fear, and the intense pressure of the media might have physically weakened these men. Yet, even with modern respirators and hazmat suits, many archaeologists still feel an overwhelming sense of dread inside the chamber. They refuse to touch the remaining sealed jars or move the final treasures. Why? Because science can explain the fungus, but it can't explain why Carter's pet canary was eaten by a cobra, the symbol of the pharaohs, on the very day the tomb opened. Some things are better left undisturbed. Tutankhamun wanted to be forgotten in the darkness. We dragged him into the light, and since then, the world has never quite looked at ancient Egypt the same way again. If Tutankhamun's curse is about a quiet, lingering shadow, then the story of Pharaoh Seqenenre is a violent, visceral scream that has been frozen in time for 3,500 years. Most mummies are prepared with divine care, limbs straightened, faces relaxed into a mask of eternal peace. But not him. When archaeologists first unwrapped Seqenenre, they didn't find a king at rest. They found a man captured in his final, agonizing moment of terror. Look at his face. His mouth is pulled back in a jagged grimace, his eyes are bulging, and his head tells a story of absolute brutality. This is why many archaeologists and curators find him deeply unsettling to handle. It doesn't feel like studying history, it feels like witnessing a murder that happened just minutes ago. For decades, the Screaming King was a mystery. Why was he buried in such a state? Was it a palace coup? A botched mummification? It wasn't until 2021, when Dr. Sahar Salim and the legendary Zahi Hawass performed a high-resolution CT scan, that the horrifying truth was revealed. Seqenenre Tao wasn't just killed, he was executed. The scans showed 5 distinct wounds to his head, each made by a different weapon. There's a massive gash in his forehead from a heavy axe, a blunt force trauma above his eye from a mace, a dagger wound behind his ear. The evidence suggests he was surrounded. He was likely on his knees, his hands tied behind his back, which explains why there are no defensive wounds on his arms. He couldn't fight back. He could only endure. But here is where the curse, or the refusal to touch, comes in. Unlike other mummies, Seqenenre Tao was mummified in a hurry. He was likely left to rot on the battlefield or in a prison cell for days before his loyalists could retrieve his body. The smell of decay was so deeply embedded into his remains that even thousands of years later, when he was first unwrapped in the 1880s, the stench of rotting flesh was said to have filled the room, making the excavators physically ill. Archaeologists today treat him with a specific kind of distance. There is a heavy psychological weight to his presence. To touch his skin is to touch the marks of a battle that changed Egypt forever. He was the king who stood up against the Hyksos invaders, the foreign rulers who had humiliated his people. His death was the spark that led his sons to eventually drive the invaders out and begin the new kingdom. Yet despite his hero status, there's an aura of unfinished business around him. The CT scans revealed that the embalmers tried to hide his horrific wounds with layers of resin, almost like a 16th century BC version of plastic surgery. They wanted to give him dignity, but the trauma was too deep to conceal. Many workers at the Cairo Museum have reported an overwhelming sense of grief when standing near his display. It's a primal reaction. Our brains are hardwired to react to a face in pain, and Seqenenre Tao's face is the ultimate expression of human suffering. Some researchers refuse to perform further invasive tests on him, arguing that he has already endured enough. To probe him further feels less like science and more like a second execution. When we talk about cursed artifacts, we often think of magic spells. But Seqenenre Tao reminds us that the most powerful curse is often the memory of a violent end. He remains a screaming testament to a war that refused to stay buried. He isn't just a king, he is a warning of what happens when the past is forced to face its own brutal reflection. Deep beneath the sands of Saqqara lies a pyramid that from the outside looks like little more than a pile of rubble. It is the Pyramid of Unas, the last king of the 5th dynasty. But don't let the exterior fool you. When you descend into its narrow, suffocating corridors, you aren't just entering a tomb. You are entering a living book of spells. For 3,000 years, these walls were sealed in total darkness. When Gaston Maspero first opened the chamber in 1881, he was stunned. Every inch of the limestone walls was covered in exquisite blue-green hieroglyphs. These are the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in human history. But these aren't prayers of peace. They are magic scrolls carved in stone, designed to ensure the king's survival in the afterlife by any means necessary. And I mean any means. What makes archaeologists hesitate here isn't a physical trap, but the chilling intensity of the words themselves. Among the spells for protection and flight, there is a section known to scholars as the Cannibal hymn. In this text, Unas is described as a god who lives on his fathers and feeds on his mothers. It says, Unas is the bull of heaven, who lives on the beings of every god, who eats their entrails. Imagine standing in a cramped, airless room, surrounded by thousands of carvings that describe a king hunting, cooking, and eating the gods to steal their power. The atmosphere inside the Unas chamber is notoriously heavy. Many epigraphers, the experts who spend hours tracing and translating these symbols, report a profound sense of nausea, sudden drops in temperature, and an overwhelming feeling of bad air. Now, skeptics will tell you it's just poor ventilation or the smell of ancient bat guano. But even the most hardened scientists admit there's something strange about the acoustics of the room. The texts were meant to be chanted. They are phonetic codes designed to vibrate at specific frequencies. When researchers speak these words aloud to study the phonetics, they often describe a vibrating energy that feels like the walls are pushing back. There is a specific reason why many areas of these texts are restricted. It's not just about preservation of the stone, it's about the psychological toll. The Egyptians believed that words had Heka, magic power. They believed that by carving these spells, the spells became eternally active. To an archaeologist, you aren't just reading a dead language, you are standing in the middle of a continuous ritual that has been running for 4,000 years. One of the most unsettling details is how the hieroglyphs are carved. In later tombs, signs of dangerous animals like lions or snakes were often carved in half or maimed so they couldn't come to life and harm the deceased. But in Unez's chamber, the magic is raw and full strength. The predators are whole. The spells are aggressive. Archaeologists who spend too much time in the subchambers often suffer from vivid, disturbing dreams. It's as if the mind, after staring at these rhythmic blue symbols for hours, begins to download the ancient fears of the Old Kingdom. There's a silent agreement among many site guards. You don't stay in the Unaz chamber after the sun goes down. We often think of scrolls as paper that can be burned, but Unaz turned his entire tomb into a permanent, indestructible scroll. It is a place where the barrier between the living and the dead is stretched thin. Scientists come for the history, but they stay for as short a time as possible, because in the Pyramid of Unaz, the walls don't just have ears, they have a hunger that science can't quite explain. In the pantheon of ancient Egypt, there is no deity more terrifying than Sekhmet. She is the powerful one, the lion-headed goddess of war, destruction, and pestilence. But she is also a goddess of healing, if and only if you can survive her rage. Throughout Egypt, thousands of statues were carved of her in hard black diorite or granite. But there's one specific collection of black quartz statues that archaeologists and museum curators treat with a level of superstitious caution that borders on the religious. Why? Because Sekhmet wasn't just a symbol. To the ancients, these statues were living vessels. During the reign of Amenhotep III, over 700 of these statues were commissioned. The goal was to appease her, to stop her from destroying humanity with plagues. This means that for over 3,000 years, these black stones were the focal point of intense, blood-soaked rituals. When you stand in front of a black quartz Sekhmet, the first thing you notice is the eyes. They don't look past you, they look through you. Many archaeologists who have worked in the Mut Temple at Karnak, where hundreds of these statues were unearthed, refuse to stay in the ruins after twilight. They describe an oppressive energy, a feeling as if the air itself has become thick and metallic, like the smell of fresh blood. There are documented accounts from museum staff in London, Paris, and Cairo who claim that the statues breathe. They report a low-frequency hum vibrating from the stone, a vibration that science struggles to explain. Geologists might point to the crystalline structure of the quartz, which can exhibit piezoelectric properties under pressure or temperature changes. But that doesn't explain the Sekhmet syndrome, a phenomenon where handlers experience sudden, irrational outbursts of anger or intense, unexplained fevers after moving the statues. In the 1970s, a group of workers moving a Sekhmet statue reported that the stone felt warm to the touch, despite being in a climate-controlled room. Moments later, the heavy lifting equipment snapped, something that shouldn't have happened under that weight. It's as if the goddess refuses to be moved without the proper ancient protocols. Archaeologists today often follow an unspoken rule: never look a Sekhmet statue directly in the eye for too long. In ancient times, priests had to perform a ritual of appeasement twice a day, 365 days a year, just to keep her calm. They would offer her beer dyed red with pomegranate juice to trick her into thinking it was blood, hoping to put her into a drunken sleep. When we dig these statues up today, we are effectively waking up a goddess of war who hasn't been fed her ritual offerings in 3 millennia. There's a famous story of a researcher who mocked the idea of the curse while working in a storage basement with a Sekhmet figure. That night, he suffered a catastrophic burst appendix. Coincidence? Perhaps. But in the world of Egyptian archaeology, coincidences involving Sekhmet tend to be unusually violent. This is why many of these statues remain in situ, left exactly where they were found in the dirt. Even the ones in world-class museums are often placed in corners or behind barriers where they won't be constantly disturbed by the flow of crowds. Curators have noted that even the most chaotic groups of schoolchildren tend to go silent when they enter a room guarded by Sekhmet. It's a primal, predatory presence. She is the goddess of the 7 arrows, the bringer of plagues. And in an era where we think we have conquered the world with science, the black stone of Sekhmet stands as a silent reminder. Some powers don't belong to the past. They are simply waiting for someone to touch the stone and wake them up. If you ever find yourself alone in a museum gallery with a lion-headed woman carved from black rock, do yourself a favor. Don't linger. She's been waiting a long time to finish her hunt. In 1925, 3 years after the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, Howard Carter found something nestled against the right thigh of the boy king's mummy. It was a dagger. At first glance, it was beautiful. A gold hilt decorated with crystal and a sheath embossed with lilies and jackal heads. But when Carter pulled the blade from its scabbard, he stopped cold. The blade wasn't gold, it wasn't bronze, it was iron. Now, you might think, what's so scary about an iron knife? Here's the problem. In 1323 BC, Egypt was still deep in the Bronze Age. Iron smelting wouldn't be mastered for another several centuries. To the Egyptians of that time, iron was more precious than gold because it didn't come from the earth. They called it Bi-Am-Ta, or iron from the sky. This dagger is a literal piece of a fallen star. And for many archaeologists, handling a weapon forged from a cosmic traveler brings a sense of otherworldly dread that no earthly artifact can match. For decades, scientists debated its origin. Was it a gift from a foreign Hittite king? Or was it something more mysterious? In 2016, using X-ray fluorescent spectrometry, researchers finally confirmed the truth. The high levels of nickel and cobalt in the blade matched the composition of the Karga meteorite, which fell hundreds of miles away from the Nile. But science only explains the material. It doesn't explain the weight of the object. There is a persistent legend among the workers who first handled the dagger that it possesses a cold that never leaves the metal. No matter how hot the Egyptian sun gets, the blade remains unnervingly chilled to the touch. Archaeologists today treat this dagger with extreme caution, not just because it's fragile, but because it represents a bridge between our world and the void of space. There is a psychological taboo about moving it. In ancient Egyptian belief, objects from the sky were considered the literal bones of the gods. To hold this knife is to hold a fragment of a deity's body that fell in fire and brimstone. There is a disturbing story, unconfirmed by official museum records, but whispered in the halls of the Cairo Museum, of a technician who was tasked with cleaning the blade's display case in the late 90s. He reported hearing a low, metallic ringing sound, like a bell being struck miles away, whenever he got too close. He suffered a sudden, severe vertigo and collapsed. He later claimed it felt as if the room's gravity had shifted, as if the dagger was trying to pull him toward it. Think about the ritual significance. This wasn't a weapon for war. It was a weapon for the afterlife. It was placed on the king's thigh to protect him as he traveled through the stars to the field of reeds. It was meant to cut through the spirits of the underworld. When we study it, we aren't just looking at a tool, we are looking at a cosmic key. Today, the dagger is kept in a highly controlled environment. Many researchers refuse to perform further invasive testing, like carbon dating or deep tissue sampling of the hilt. They say it's to preserve the artifact. But if you talk to them off the record, they'll tell you something else. The blade feels awake. There's a primal fear of weapons that don't belong to our world. We see it in our modern myths of alien technology, but for King Tut, it was a reality. He went into the grave armed with a star. And as we look at that unrusted, perfectly preserved iron today, We have to ask, if it came from the heavens to guard a king, what happens to the mortals who dare to take it away? Some artifacts are protected by spells. This one is protected by the cold, infinite silence of the cosmos. And that is a curse that no science can ever break. They call it the most beautiful object in the world. A 45-carat deep blue diamond that seems to hold the mysteries of the ocean within its facets. But behind the reinforced glass of the Smithsonian Institution lies a trail of blood, bankruptcy, and madness that spans 4 centuries and 3 continents. This is the Hope Diamond, but for those who know its true history, it is anything but hopeful. The story begins in the 17th century in India, at the Kolar mine. Legend says the stone wasn't found in a cave. It was plucked from the eye of a statue of the goddess Sita. This was the first act of desecration. The goddess, robbed of her sight, supposedly cursed anyone who would dare to own her eye. And the curse didn't wait long to strike. Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, the French gem merchant who brought the stone to Europe, was said to have been torn apart by wild dogs in Russia shortly after selling it. But that was just the beginning. The diamond found its way into the French royal court, becoming the French blue. Its most famous owners? King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. We all know how their story ended, under the cold blade of the guillotine during the French Revolution. After the chaos in France, the diamond vanished, only to reappear in London years later, now cut smaller to hide its identity. It was purchased by Henry Philip Hope, from whom it gets its modern name. But the Hope family soon fell into financial ruin. The stone was sold, and then the real horror began. Every owner seemed to meet a tragic fate. Prince Ivan Kanitovsky was killed by revolutionaries. A Greek merchant drove his car over a cliff. But the most chilling chapter belongs to Evelyn Walsh McLean, a wealthy American socialite who bought the diamond in 1911. She wore it to parties, even putting it on her dog's collar, mocking the curse. The results were devastating. Her eldest son was killed in a car accident. Her daughter died of a drug overdose. Her husband ran off with another woman and died in a mental institution. Eventually, the family fortune evaporated. Evelyn died alone, still clutching the blue stone that had systematically destroyed everything she loved. So, why do archaeologists and gemologists today treat it with such hands-off reverence? Is it just a superstition? In 1958, the diamond was donated to the Smithsonian. The man who delivered it, James Todd, had his leg crushed in a truck accident shortly after. Then his wife died of a heart attack. Then his house burned down. It was as if the diamond was giving one last parting gift of misery before being locked away. But here is the scientific insight that makes it truly eerie. Most blue diamonds get their color from boron, but the Hope diamond has a unique, terrifying property. When you expose it to shortwave ultraviolet light, the diamond doesn't just glow, it glows blood red. Long after the UV light is turned off, the stone continues to phosphoresce, shining like a glowing ember for several minutes. To the naked eye, it's a brilliant blue. But in the dark, under the right conditions, it looks like a heart of fire. Scientists call it a chemical reaction. But for the researchers who study it, standing in a dark lab with a diamond that is bleeding red light, it feels like the stone is alive. It feels like the eye of the goddess is finally seeing the darkness it has caused. Today, the Smithsonian refuses to let anyone wear it. It stays behind a rotating glass plinth, protected by layers of steel and sensors. There is no plan to ever recut it or remove it from its setting. It has become a forbidden object, not because it's fragile, but because we've finally learned our lesson. Some beauties are meant to be admired from a distance, because if you look too closely into the deep blue of the Hope diamond, you might just find that the curse is looking back at you. In 1924, deep in the jungles of British Honduras, now Belize, a young girl named Anna Mitchell-Hedges was celebrating her 17th birthday in the most extraordinary way. She was exploring the ruins of a lost Maya city called Lubantun with her father, the explorer Frederick Mitchell-Hedges. As she peered through a crack in a collapsed altar, she saw something glittering in the dust. It was a skull, but it wasn't made of bone. It was carved from a single, massive block of clear quartz crystal. They called it the Skull of Doom. And for the next 80 years, this object would become a focal point for supernatural claims, scientific investigation, and a deep-seated fear that some things are better left buried in the jungle. The skull is a masterpiece of craftsmanship. It's anatomically perfect, featuring a detachable jaw that moves on polished sockets. But here's where the mystery begins. The Maya, or any ancient civilization for that matter, supposedly lacked the tools to carve such a hard material against the natural grain of the crystal. If it were carved by hand with sand and water, experts estimate it would have taken 300 years of continuous daily scrubbing to achieve this level of smoothness. Frederick Mitchell-Hedges himself was terrified of it. He wrote in his memoirs that the skull was the embodiment of all evil, and that several people who have scoffed at it have died, and others have been struck by strange illnesses. He refused to speak about its origin in detail, claiming it was used by Maya high priests to will death upon their enemies. They believed that if the priest looked into the skull and visualized a person, that person would simply stop breathing. As the skull traveled the world, the stories grew. People who sat in a room with the skull reported hearing chanting, feeling strange vibrations, and seeing vivid, terrifying visions of ancient disasters within its depths. Some claimed the skull could change color or emit a strange white mist. But then science stepped in. In the 1970s, the skull was taken to the labs of Hewlett-Packard. The technicians there were baffled. They found that the skull was carved with total disregard for the crystal's axis, something that should have caused the quartz to shatter during the carving process. One researcher famously said, "This blinking thing shouldn't even exist." However, modern scanning technology in the early 2000s revealed a different, perhaps even more unsettling truth. Under high-powered electron microscopes, researchers found tiny, microscopic markings that could only have been made by high-speed, rotary diamond tools. Tools that didn't exist in the ancient Maya world. The evidence suggested the skull was a 19th century creation, possibly made in Germany and sold as an ancient relic. So if it's a fake, why do archaeologists still refuse to touch it or include it in major exhibitions? Because the curse of the crystal skull isn't about its age, it's about its effect on the human mind. The Skull of Doom acts as a perfect optical lens. Because of how it was carved, it funnels light from the base directly through the eye sockets. If you stare into those crystal eyes for too long, the light patterns can trigger a form of self-hypnosis or hallucinations. Archaeologists often speak of the Stendhal syndrome, a physical illness caused by being exposed to an object of overwhelming beauty or mystery. The Mitchell-Hedges skull is the ultimate trigger. Even knowing it might be a modern creation doesn't stop the feeling of being watched that many curators report. It has a weight of belief attached to it that makes it dangerous. There is a final, darker theory, that the skull was intended to be a vessel for collective human fear. Whether it was carved 3,000 years ago or 100 years ago, it has been the center of so much focused negative energy and belief in death that it has become charged. Today, the skull is kept in private hands, away from the general public. Most major museums, like the British Museum, have moved their own crystal skulls into storage, away from the main galleries. They say it's because they are frauds. But if you ask the people who have to move those crates, they'll tell you they don't care about the history. They just don't like the way the crystal eyes seem to follow them in the dark. Fake or not, the Skull of Doom still holds its power. And sometimes, a lie told with enough conviction can be just as deadly as a real curse. In the heart of modern-day Mexico City, buried beneath the bustling streets and the Grand Cathedral, lies a place that was once the epicenter of a civilization's cosmic terror. Templo Mayor, the great temple of the Aztecs. At its summit stood two shrines, and before them, a low, volcanic stone altar known as a Tecatl. For centuries, this wasn't just a piece of architecture, it was a machine of death. Archaeologists today treat these altars with a specific kind of professional distance, a silence that borders on the sacred. Why? Because when you stand before a Tecatl, you aren't just looking at a relic. You are looking at a site where, according to some estimates, tens of thousands of people took their final breath. The ritual was as precise as it was horrific. 4 priests would hold the victim by their limbs, stretching their chest tight over the convex surface of the stone. A 5th priest, using a blade of razor-sharp volcanic glass, would make a single, swift incision. The heart, still beating, was ripped from the chest and offered to the sun god, Huitzilopochtli, to ensure that the world wouldn't end in eternal darkness. But the story doesn't end with the fall of the Aztec Empire in 1521. The curse of Templo Mayor is felt by the very people who dig there today. Unlike Egyptian tombs, where the fear is often about invisible fungi, the threat here is psychological and visceral. The stone itself is porous. Volcanic basalt and andesite act like a sponge. When archaeologists first unearthed the main sacrificial stones in the late 20th century, they performed forensic tests on the rock. They found that the proteins from human blood had seeped so deeply into the microscopic pores of the stone that they were still detectable 500 years later. To touch the stone is to literally touch the biological remains of the victims. Many researchers who work in the sacred precinct report an overwhelming sense of heaviness or pressure in the air. There are stories of excavators who, after spending too much time clearing the dirt around the altars, suffer from sudden piercing chest pains, pains that doctors cannot explain. It's as if the site is echoing the trauma of the hearts it once claimed. Local workers often refuse to be alone in the excavation pits after the sun begins to set. They speak of the Tsumpantli, the skull racks, and how the shadows of the stones seem to move independently of the light. One leading archaeologist once remarked that the ground here is hungry. It's a feeling that the earth hasn't quite finished its work. And then there's the whistle of death. Archaeologists found small, skull-shaped clay whistles buried near these altars. When blown, they produce a sound that has been described as the scream of 1,000 corpses. Researchers who have studied the acoustics of Templo Mayor believe these whistles were used during the processions to the altar to shatter the willpower of the victims. Today, many museums keep these whistles in silent displays, refusing to let them be blown, fearing that the frequency of the sound might wake up the energy of the stones. There is a profound ethical debate in Mexican archaeology. Should these stones even be touched? Some believe that by cleaning them, by putting them under bright museum lights, we are stripping away the only thing they have left, their dark, terrible dignity. To an archaeologist, the Tetzalcoatl is a challenge to our understanding of civilization. It represents a society that believed blood was the only currency that could keep the universe alive. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, you cannot deny the weight of that belief. When you stand near the altar at Templo Mayor, the air feels thin and the silence is deafening. It is a place where the past isn't just a memory, it's a physical, pulsing presence that demands you look away. The Aztecs believed the sun required hearts to rise. Standing there today, you might just find yourself checking your own pulse, wondering if the stone is still waiting for its next offering. In the deep, dark mythology of the Aztecs, death wasn't an end. It was a journey through 9 levels of a cold, terrifying underworld called Mictlan. And at the end of that journey, waiting in the darkness, was Mictlantecuhtli, the lord of the land of the dead. But what happens when that god of shadows takes on a physical form? Archaeologists at Templo Mayor discovered several masks that look like something out of a nightmare. These aren't carvings made of wood or clay. These are cranial masks. They are made from actual human skulls, the bone painstakingly cleaned, then inlaid with vibrant turquoise, obsidian eyes, and shells to create a face that is both beautiful and horrifying. To hold this mask is to hold the literal face of a person who lived 500 years ago, transformed into a god. And this is exactly why modern researchers treat them with a level of dread that few other artifacts command. Mictlantecuhtli was often depicted with his skin peeling off, his skeletal jaw hanging open to swallow the stars. The masks found by archaeologists capture this in-between state perfectly. The turquoise represents life, while the bone represents the eternal. But there's a dark biological secret to these masks. When forensic teams analyzed the bone, they found that these weren't just random skulls. They belonged to high-ranking warriors and nobles, and the marks on the bone suggest they were processed immediately after death. The curse associated with these masks is less about sudden death and more about interference. In the archives of the National Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico, there are persistent reports of electronic equipment failing whenever these masks are being photographed or scanned. Cameras refuse to focus. Digital files become corrupted for no apparent reason. It's as if the Lord of the Underworld refuses to have his image captured by modern technology. But the psychological effect is even stronger. Imagine being an archaeologist in a dimly lit storage room, opening a drawer and seeing those obsidian eyes staring back at you. Obsidian, for the Aztecs, was a smoking mirror, a material used for scrying and looking into the future. Many curators report that if you look into the obsidian pupils of the mask for too long, you lose your sense of time. You begin to feel a pulling sensation, as if your own life force is being weighed against the cold weight of the bone. There is a ritualistic heaviness to these masks. They were often found buried in offerings, along with sacrificial knives and the bones of eagles. They weren't meant to be seen by the living, they were meant to guard the foundations of the temple, keeping the balance between our world and the underworld. By digging them up, archaeologists have effectively broken a 500-year-old seal. One famous story involves a researcher who was studying the nerve paths carved into the bone of a Mictlantecuhtli mask. That night, he dreamt of a colossal figure standing at the foot of his bed, silent and skinless, demanding the return of his face. The researcher was so shaken that he refused to work on the project again. It's a common theme, the feeling that by studying these masks, you are inviting an ancient, hungry presence into your own life. Even today, when these masks are moved for international exhibitions, they are handled with a silence that is unusual for museum workers. There's no joking, no lighthearted talk. There's only a profound respect for the Lord of the Dead. The takeaway here is simple. The Aztecs didn't fear death. They respected its power. They knew that once you put on the mask of Mictlantecuhtli, there is no coming back. We look at these masks as art, but they were designed as gateways. And as any archaeologist will tell you, sometimes it's better not to know what's waiting on the other side of the gate. If you ever see those turquoise teeth and obsidian eyes in a museum, remember, you aren't just looking at history. You are looking at the face that, according to the Aztecs, we will all have to meet eventually. And he isn't in a hurry. He has all the time in the world. Rising from the jungle floor of the Yucatan Peninsula, El Castillo, the Pyramid of Kukulcan, is a masterpiece of ancient geometry. We've all seen the pictures. The shadow of the serpent crawling down the stairs during the equinox. But there is a secret side to this pyramid that the millions of tourists who visit Chichen Itza never get to see. In 1930, archaeologists discovered that El Castillo is like a Russian nesting doll. Inside the outer pyramid lies a second, older temple, and deep within that inner sanctum, at the top of a narrow, humid stone staircase, they found a room that wasn't meant for human eyes. Inside sat a throne carved from a single block of limestone, painted a vivid, blood red and shaped like a snarling jaguar. Its eyes, 74 discs of pure green jade that seemed to glow in the dark. This is the Red Jaguar throne. And since 2006, the Mexican government has officially banned anyone from entering the inner chamber. While the official reason is preservation and safety, many who have spent time inside that cramped, airless room tell a different story. They speak of a jaguar's curse, a psychological and physical weight that guards the heart of the pyramid. To reach the jaguar, you have to climb a staircase so narrow and steep that it induces instant claustrophobia. The humidity inside is nearly 100%, and the air is thick with the smell of wet stone and ancient dust. Archaeologists who led the early excavations reported that the atmosphere inside wasn't just uncomfortable. It was aggressive. Many suffered from sudden, intense panic attacks, claiming they felt the walls closing in, or worse, that something was breathing behind them in the dark. The jaguar itself is a terrifying object. The red paint is made from cinnabar, a mineral containing mercury. For decades, researchers handled the throne without realizing they were slowly being poisoned by toxic vapors. But beyond the chemical danger, there is the spiritual one. In Maya belief, the Jaguar was the lord of the underworld, capable of moving between the realms of the living and the dead. The throne was a portal. There are chilling accounts from the last few guards allowed inside before the 2006 closure. They reported that the jade eyes of the Jaguar would shift. Not that the stones moved, but that the expression in the eyes would change from a dull stone to a predatory glare. Some claimed they heard a low, guttural growl vibrating through the floorboards, a sound that matched the frequency of a large feline. In 1990, a group of researchers attempted to use ground-penetrating radar inside the chamber. The equipment, which had worked perfectly outside, suddenly began to malfunction. The screens filled with static, and the data showed ghost structures, rooms and tunnels that didn't physically exist according to their maps. It was as if the pyramid was hiding its true shape from modern sensors. Local Maya descendants who work at the site today still leave offerings of tobacco and honey at the base of the pyramid. They believe that the Aluxes, mischievous and sometimes dangerous spirits, guard the red Jaguar. They warn that the inner temple is tired of being poked and prodded by outsiders. When a tourist fell to her death from the exterior steps in 2006, it was the final straw. The authorities sealed the tunnel leading to the Jaguar. Today, that red throne sits in total darkness, its 74 jade eyes staring at a wall that no one is allowed to cross. Archaeologists today treat El Castillo with a look but don't touch policy. They use drones and remote sensors because the human cost of entering that inner sanctum has become too high. Is it the mercury in the paint? Is it the crushing humidity? Or is it the fact that we've disturbed a king's seat that was never meant to be empty? The red Jaguar remains one of the few artifacts in this world that has successfully pushed humanity back. It reclaimed its throne in the dark, reminding us that some parts of history are not for our consumption. They are for the gods, and the gods do not like to share. In the rugged, untamed mountains of Arcadia, Greece, there is a power that doesn't reside in temples of marble and gold. It lives in the shadows of the trees, in the sudden silence of a forest, and in the ancient stone statues of a deity who is half man, half goat. This is Pan, the god of the wild, of shepherds, and of a primal, irrational terror that we still call panic. Archaeologists who specialize in Greek antiquity often treat sites dedicated to Pan differently than they do the Parthenon. While the temples of Athena or Apollo feel like monuments to human reason, the shrines of Pan feel like a descent into the animal brain. And there is one specific ancient statue of Pan, found in a remote cave in the Arcadian highlands, that researchers have described as unbearable to be near. The statue isn't elegant. It's rough, earthy, and depicts Pan with a leering, chaotic grin and a gaze that seems to vibrate with a disturbing sexual and violent energy. But the curse of Pan isn't a spell written on a scroll. It is a biological and psychological reaction to the environment he represents. The term panic comes from the belief that Pan, when disturbed from his midday nap, would let out a shout so terrifying that it caused hearts to stop and armies to flee in mindless stampedes. Modern archaeologists who have attempted to excavate his grottos report a strange, recurring phenomenon: silent panic. Without any warning, entire teams have been known to drop their tools and run out of the caves, unable to explain why they felt an overwhelming sense of impending doom. Is it a gas leak? Is it infrasound, low-frequency sound waves that the human ear can't hear, but the body feels as intense anxiety? Geologists have searched for these answers, but the results are always inconclusive. What remains is the testimony of the experts. One lead researcher noted that while cleaning the Pan statue, he felt a rhythm, a thumping like a heavy heartbeat coming from the very ground beneath his feet. There is a historical heaviness to Pan. Unlike the other gods who moved to Mount Olympus, Pan stayed in the dirt. He is the only Greek god who is said to have actually died. When a sailor in the era of Tiberius heard a voice across the water crying out, "The great god Pan is dead," It marked the end of the old world. But archaeologists believe Pan didn't die, he was just buried. And he is very angry about it. In the 19th century, a British collector tried to remove a smaller Pan figure from an Akkadian shrine. Within days, his local guides vanished, claiming the goatfoot was hunting them. The collector himself was found weeks later, wandering the hills, unable to speak. His hair turned white from shock. He died without ever explaining what he saw in the shadows of the Arcadia oaks. Today, many Pan artifacts are kept in open-air museums or left in the caves where they were found. Curators have observed that these statues seem to attract wild incidents. Equipment failure is common, but more disturbingly, people's behavior changes. Calm, rational scientists find themselves snapping at one another, overwhelmed by sudden animalistic aggression. Archaeologists refuse to perform deep excavations in the core areas of Arcadia, dedicated to Pan, because the land itself seems to resist. Landslides, sudden freak storms, and equipment being lost in the thick undergrowth are too frequent to be mere coincidence. It's as if the god of the wild is reclaiming his territory stone by stone. We like to think we are masters of nature, but the statue of Pan stands as a reminder that underneath our clothes and our technology, we are still animals. And animals know when they are being hunted. To touch a Pan statue is to invite that primal raw chaos back into your mind. It is to remember what it feels like to be afraid of the dark. And for many experts, that is a discovery they are not willing to make. Pan is still there, napping in the silence of Arcadia, and for the sake of your sanity, you'd better let him sleep. We have traveled from the tombs of Egypt to the jungles of Mexico, but our final destination brings us to the most sacred and dangerous spot in the ancient Greek world, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. High on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the Greeks believed they had found the omphalos, the literal navel of the earth. But deep within the foundations of this temple lies a restricted area that even modern archaeologists approach with extreme trepidation. It is called the Adyton, a word that literally translates to the place not to be entered. For over 1,000 years, this was the seat of the Pythia, the oracle of Delphi. She was a woman who sat on a bronze tripod over a dark chasm in the earth, inhaling strange vapors to deliver prophecies that decided the fate of empires. But when the temple was officially excavated in the 1890s, French archaeologists expected to find a massive cave or a deep volcanic vent. Instead, they found almost nothing, just a confusing mess of faults and cracks in the limestone. For a long time, science dismissed the oracle's magic as a myth. But in the early 2000s, a team of geologists and toxicologists decided to look deeper, and what they found was a physical curse that still lingers in the air today. The temple is built directly over the intersection of two major geological fault lines. Deep underground, friction and heat release a cocktail of gases, specifically ethylene, ethane, and methane. Ethylene is a powerful hallucinogen. In small doses, it causes a state of euphoria. But in a confined, unventilated space like the Adyton, it is a poison that induces violent seizures, frantic screaming, and, eventually, total mental collapse. This is the curse that archaeologists refuse to touch today. The Adyton isn't just a historical site, it's an active geological trap. Even now, gas levels in the lower foundations can spike without warning. There are records of modern researchers who, despite wearing safety monitors, have reported sudden bouts of Delphic madness, a feeling of intense pressure in the skull, followed by vivid, auditory hallucinations. They hear voices in the wind that sounds like the python, the legendary serpent Apollo was said to have slain at this very spot. But there is a deeper mystery. Ancient texts speak of a chasm that led directly to the underworld, a hole so deep it had no bottom. During the late Roman era, the temple was desecrated, and this chasm was filled in with tons of rubble and lead to seal it forever. Modern archaeologists have debated reopening this deep shaft to see what lies at the bottom. But the consensus among the Greek authorities has been a firm no. Why? Because Delphi is a place where the earth still speaks. Beyond the toxic gas, there's the infrasound effect. The unique shape of the mountains around Delphi creates low-frequency sound waves that resonate within the temple's foundations. These frequencies can trigger a fear response in the human amygdala, causing a sensation of a supernatural presence. To dig deeper is to risk the structural integrity of the site and perhaps to release concentrations of gas that haven't seen the light of day in 2,000 years. There is a final, chilling story. In the 2nd century AD, a group of frustrated priests forced the oracle to go into the Adyton, even though the omens were bad. She descended, but instead of a prophecy, she let out a scream that was heard throughout the valley. She ran out of the chamber, collapsed, and died days later, claiming she had seen the shadow of the god instead of his light. Today, the inner sanctum of Delphi remains a restricted access zone for deep excavation. We have the technology to drill down, to use robots to clear the rubble, but we don't. We have learned to respect the Adyton. We have learned that some places on this planet are thin, places where the gas, the sound, and the history combine to create a reality that our modern minds simply cannot handle. The oracle is silent now, but the earth at Delphi is still breathing. And as our 12th and final artifact, it serves as the ultimate takeaway. Archaeology is the study of what we have found, but wisdom is knowing what to leave buried. From the gold of Tutankhamun to the vapors of Delphi, these 12 artifacts remind us that the past isn't just a collection of dead objects. It is a living, breathing power. These are the things archaeologists refuse to touch, not out of weakness, but out of a profound, hard-earned respect for the unknown. Some doors were closed for a reason, and perhaps for the sake of our future, they should stay that way.